phi201 Epistemology. You are welcome to study session 1. The nature of epistemology. Introduction. This session will introduce you to issues in epistemology, after which you will be introduced to concepts in epistemology. Defining these concepts will enable you to understand them better as we go through the course. You will also have an insight into the historical background of epistemology. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define and use correctly the terms in bold. That is, epistemology and knowledge. 2. Discuss the forms of knowledge. 3. Describe the sources of knowledge. And 4. Discuss how knowledge relates to beliefs and justification. Defining epistemology. The term epistemology is coined from the two Greek words episteme, which means knowledge, and logos, which means logic or rational. The two words then form the definition of epistemology, which simply can be defined as the theory of knowledge. As a branch of philosophy, epistemology deals with the scope, nature, extent, and limits of human knowledge. It also deals with the certainty and reliability of human knowledge. As a matter of fact, an epistemologist, John Locke, while discussing his objective concerning the theory of knowledge, explains that his aim is to inquire into the origin, certainty, and extent of human knowledge. Also, epistemology centers around the fact of wanting to know, to understand, and consequently to offer a well-considered explanation of why things are the way they are. Since epistemology is about human knowledge, the main subjects of human knowledge are human cognizers, and the objects of human knowledge are external objects. The questions that come to mind now as they relate to epistemology are: what is knowledge? How do we arrive at reliable knowledge, granted that sometimes our senses do deceive us to take triangular objects to be rectangular? How does one determine genuine knowledge as distinguished from mere opinion or belief? Differently put, what are the basic criteria for determining knowledge? Can we ever have certain knowledge? Central to all these questions is the idea of certainty, which is significant in determining knowledge. We should not lose sight of a major epistemological problem, as pointed out by Ozumba, 2001. This is the fact that the objects of knowledge are unlimited, while the human subject is limited and almost ill-equipped for a reliable quest into matters of knowledge. The problem has led to a major divide between philosophers. For some, genuine knowledge is impossible, while for others, we can have knowledge of some external objects only if we employ the method of doubt. What is knowledge? Ozumba, 2001, defines knowledge as a state of awareness of a given factor information. Knowledge can also be defined as the fact of understanding information acquired through learning or experience. To know, therefore, involves being aware of something, being certain about it, learning and remembering something, having an understanding of the object of knowledge, being familiar with something, being able to recognize or identify something, being able to distinguish between things, having enough experience and training, and finally, being intimate with something. Philosophically, the standard account of knowledge, around which all recent epistemological works have been done, defines knowledge as justified true belief. This definition has it that Mr. A knows that P, if and only if 1. P is true. 2. Mr. A believes that P. 3. Mr. A is justified in believing that P. Because there are 3 parts to this definition, it is popularly called the tripartite definition or account of knowledge. We can describe the 3 accounts as the true condition, the belief condition, and the justification condition. These 3 conditions must obtain for a person's knowledge claim to count as knowledge. A person cannot be said to know if one of these 3 conditions is absent when making a knowledge claim. At this point, we can say that the question of what is knowledge, which seems to be about a phenomenon in the world, becomes transformed, at least partly, into a linguistic question, a question about the definition of the word know. The next question then is what and how can we know? Kinds of knowledge. In telling us something about the kinds of knowledge that there are, most epistemologists have drawn a distinction between a posterior, that is, empirical knowledge, and a priori knowledge. A posteriori, that is, empirical, knowledge is knowledge derivable only from experience, and a priori knowledge is knowledge gained by reason alone. The questions that I expect somebody to ask are there really these 2 kinds of knowledge? Is it easy to produce examples which seem to show that there must be? If I come to know that a particular blackboard is black by looking at it, that is knowledge that I have gained by experience. In this case, by my visual experience. And if I know that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C, or that no statement can be both wholly true and wholly false at the same time. Surely, that is something that my reason tells me when I reflect on what the statement is saying. Some philosophers have wanted to deny that experience by itself can be a source of knowledge, and others have denied that reason alone can be. Descartes, a popular French thinker, is an example of a philosopher who denies that the senses alone can be a source of knowledge. By contrast, John Stuart Mill took opposing position. For him, all knowledge is empirical. It is on this basis of this that he denies the existence of any a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge derived from reason. Mill thinks that even the principle of non-contradiction, that is, the principle that no statement can be both wholly true and wholly false at the same time, is known empirically. In order to better understand the distinction between deriving knowledge from experience and deriving knowledge from reason, it is important for you to ask these questions again. What are the arguments for and against claiming that there are two sources of knowledge? What are the implications of accepting either view? Sources of knowledge. Empiricism. It is natural, when we start reflecting on where our knowledge comes from, to pick on sense experience as the main and perhaps the only source of knowledge. We know about the things around us because we can use our senses to see them, touch, hear them, and so on. This school of thought is known as empiricism. Empiricism is the school of thought that holds that our knowledge of the external world is derived from our five senses. These senses are the avenues through which the mind receives information about the external world. We have empiricists like John Locke, David Hume, and George Berkeley. They are all British empiricists. Though they differ in their empiricist conceptions, they all agree that all knowledge comes from experience. John Locke, for instance, maintains that what we perceive are ideas and they are received through sensation and reflection. For him, there is nothing in the intellectual that was not first in the senses. For George Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. Esse est percipi. What cannot be perceived does not exist. For David Hume, all the materials of knowledge, no matter how fantastic they are, must be traceable to experience, or else they are mere phantoms and fabrications of the mind. Ideas that are regarded as the faint copies of impressions are taken seriously if they derive from a clear impression. Otherwise, they are chimerical. Let us then examine the views of each of these empiricists in turn. John Locke, as an empiricist, he claims, for example, that it is an established opinion among some men that there are in the understanding certain innate principles stamped upon the mind of man, which the soul receives in its very first beginning and brings into the world with it. Locke calls this opinion a mistaken one, denying that ideas are innate and that those who hold such views are wrong. Having denied the existence of innate ideas, Locke established the philosophical basis for his empiricist arguments. All ideas arise from experience, and these experiential ideas provide us with two types of knowledge, namely, sensation and reflection. The first knowledge is that of sensation. This occurs when the mind receives different perceptions through the senses. Through this process, the mind becomes used to these objects. From this, the mind has the ideas of cold, yellow, hardness, taste, and other sensible qualities. This is what Locke calls sensation. The second type of knowledge furnished by experience is reflection. This is an activity of the mind which produces ideas. But this production of ideas is based on the first set of ideas furnished by the senses. These mind activities include perception, thinking, doubting, reasoning, knowing and willing, and so on. It is this reflective power of the mind that works on the sensible ideas given to the mind by experience. The first set of ideas can be said to be simple ideas. This is the chief source of the materials the reflective mind works on. The second set of ideas is complex ideas. These are a compound of simple ideas put together by the active power of the mind. Having explained that ideas are derived from experience, Locke makes a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Before this distinction, It distinguishes between idea and quality. It says, whatsoever the mind perceives in itself, or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, that I call ideas. He calls quality the power to produce any idea in our mind, quality of the subject, wherever that power is. In distinguishing between primary and secondary qualities, Locke explains that the primary qualities of bodies are those which are utterly inseparable from the body in what state whatsoever it be. These include qualities like solidity, extension, figure, motion, or rest and number. They cannot be deprived of these qualities by any mechanical deformation. Ideas of secondary qualities include colors, sounds, taste, and so on. The qualities themselves, in truth, are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce the various sensations in us by their primary qualities. Having distinguished between primary and secondary qualities, Locke held the view that qualities need adequate support, and substance is that something which provides this support. The notion of substance was taken from the common sense point of view. Though inevitable to common sense, Locke was still unable to describe it precisely, saying that if anyone will examine himself concerning the notion of pure substance in general, he will find that he has no other idea of it at all. George Berkeley as an empiricist. The central empiricist claim of Berkeley is based on his account of reality. First, Berkeley claims that objects of such knowledge are ideas. For example, he says that as several ideas are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name and be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistency, having been observed to go together, are accounted one distinct thing signified by the name apple, as other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book, and the like sensible things. There is something which perceives these ideas or objects of knowledge. In line with this, Berkeley claims that to be is to be perceived, and to be perceived is to be perceived as an idea. On this claim, he argues that it is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing among men that house, mountains, rivers, and in a word all sensible objects have an existence natural or real distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But this opinion, according to him, involves a manifest contradiction. For what are the forementioned objects but ideas or sensations? And it is not plainly repugnant that any one of these or any combination of them should exist unperceived. These two claims of Berkeley show his own account of reality. The first argument that objects are collections of ideas rests on Berkeley's claim that what are perceived are ideas. And if what are perceived are collections of ideas, it follows that objects are perceived are collections of ideas. Let us take a car, for example. On Berkeley's account, a car is a collection of ideas of a certain figure, a certain color, a certain texture, and so on. All these are ideas that are perceived when the car is perceived. This is applicable to any other object. The argument is a derivation of the empiricist tradition to which Berkeley belongs. That is, if what are perceived are ideas, it follows that an account of reality rests on what is perceived and not on what is not perceived. To test the truth or falsity of the existence of an object, therefore, such verification proceeds on the basis of what is perceived. For example, if there is an object, say tomato, on the table and there are two persons, if one claims that he sees a red object called tomato and the other person denies this, on Berkeley's account, this can be verified only by an examination of what is perceived. The first person that claims he perceived this object will show that he perceives the idea of color, the idea of figure, and the idea of a size. All these are because it stands in a sensory state of perception. The justification for the claim that the object tomato is on the table is based on experience. Although this object exists only as an idea that is perceived. A relevant question that may be asked is, why did Berkeley claim that objects are collections of ideas? Likely answers are: 1. Because objects are collections of qualities. 2. Qualities are ideas. And 3. Objects are collections of ideas. Berkeley's second argument is an advancement of the first. His argument here shows that what is not perceived does not exist. Jonathan Bennett gives an understanding of Berkeley's second claim. He states that Berkeley's hope to connect what there is with what is perceived. Based on this, Bennett claims that it is inevitable for Berkeley to equate X as an idea belonging to object O, with X is perceiving O. This equation is what yields Berkeley's conclusion that no object can exist unless someone perceives it. David Holmes as an empiricist. Two empiricist claims of David Holmes will be discussed under this heading. One of his meaning of empiricism, which is also in general epistemological principle. On the other is account of causation. All our ideas, the content of our thoughts, are derived from impressions, the content of our sense experience, which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent. What this means is that all our knowledge are derived from empirical impressions. There are two arguments that Holmes often defends in his meaning empiricism thesis. One is that wherever one has a simple idea, one also has impressions which correspond to the idea one has. For an idea to correspond to an impression, it means that the idea resembles the impression in all its material, and the resemblance is not a matter of coincidence or chance. This is why Holmes himself argues that such a constant conjunction in such an infinite number of instances can never arise from chance, but clearly proves a dependence of the impression on the ideas and of the ideas on the impressions. What this means is that our simple ideas are copies of our impressions. Given that these impressions are not innate, it follows that these impressions are derived from experience. The second argument that Holmes tenders for his meaning empiricism is that whoever does not have impressions due to certain defects cannot have simple ideas. This is why Holmes argues that if due to defect of the organ, a man is not able to have sensation, we will realize that he also lacks the corresponding ideas. For Holmes, a blind man can form no notion of colors, a deaf man of sounds. From this claim, what we can deduce is that whoever does not have impressions cannot have simple ideas. This is to foreclose the possibility of simple ideas arising from sources different from impressions. However, Holmes' second empiricist claim is his account of causation. The focus here is on the philosophical problem of the connection between a cause and its effect. The issue is about whether the connection between a cause and its effect is a necessary connection or whether it is a connection derived from experience. Holmes does not deny that there can be a connection between a cause and its effect. But his argument is that the connection between a cause and its effect is not that of necessity. After experience of the constant conjunction of certain objects, we reason in the following manner. Such an object is always found to produce another. It is impossible it could have this effect if it was not endowed with a power of production. The power necessarily implies the effect, and therefore there is a just foundation for drawing a conclusion from the existence of the one object to that of its usual attendants. The past production implies a power. The power implies a new production, and the new production is what we infer from the power and the past production. Holmes' argument is that the relation between a cause and its effect is that of constant conjunction. This conjunction is a regular one, often found between two events, and there is nothing in any object considered in it, which can afford us a reason for drawing a conclusion beyond it. Even after the observation of the frequent or constant conjunction of objects, we have no reason, or we are not justified, to draw any inference concerning any object beyond those of which we have had experience. Holmes' argument here is that we know about the frequent conjunction of objects through experience, but we cannot actually comprehend any connection between them. Also, Holmes explains that what we often observe amongst events are regularities, but that we erroneously, having observed these regularities for some time, attach a necessary connection amongst the events. Beside this account of causation, Holmes makes a distinction between what he calls a relation of ideas and matters of fact. Knowledge of algebra and mathematics belongs to relation of ideas, while knowledge from experience belongs to matters of fact. He states this in his argument by dividing all the objects of human reasoning or inquiry into two kinds: relation of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, and in short, every affirmation that is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is anywhere existence in the universe. Matters of fact are not ascertained in this same manner, nor are our evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. It is possible to have the contrary of matter of fact. The affirmation of such a proposition with its contrary can never imply a contradiction. Following this distinction is the distinction between analytic statement and synthetic statement. Synthetic statements are statements about matters of fact that can be confirmed or refuted by experience, while analytic statements are statements about the relation between the subject and the predicate. They are not about matters of fact, therefore, they cannot be confirmed or refuted by experience. Given this account of relation of ideas and matters of fact, one can say that cause belongs to matters of fact because whatever connection there is between a cause and its effect is derived from experience and observation. Rationalism. Another source of knowledge is reason or intellect. Philosophers have argued that it is our intellect that tells us of the truth of logic and mathematics. We just see, that is, in a non-visual sense of the term, that certain things are true, or that one thing follows from another. The school of thought that holds this view is called rationalism. Rationalism is the school of thought that holds that knowledge is derived from logical mathematical reasoning. René Descartes, Benedict Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz are continental rationalists, and they all hold the belief that knowledge comes not from experience but from a mental process that is intuitive and deductive. They also jointly maintain that there are certain innate principles that exist prior to experience. For instance, all mathematical axioms are taken to be true. They are accepted, not experienced, and are only proved using deductive procedures. For these rationalist philosophers, the mind has the innate capacity to unveil this mathematical truth without necessarily experiencing them. We need to further discuss these continental rationalists. Descartes as a rationalist. Descartes set out to give philosophy a new starting point, breaking away with the philosophical tradition of his day. Being a mathematician of distinction, he saw the solution to problems of epistemology in the systematization of knowledge in geometrical form. This involved starting from axioms whose truths are clear and distinct. He describes the ideal method in the second chapter of the Discourse on Method as 1. Not to accept as true anything of which do not have a clear and distinct idea. 2. To analyze the problem. 3. To start from simple and certain thoughts and proceed from them to the more complex. And 4. To review the file so thoroughly that no considerations are omitted. The question then is, of what do we have clear and distinct ideas? To deal with this problem, Descartes employs the method of doubt, a form of skepticism. This method involves setting aside anything that can be supposed false until one arrives at something that cannot be supposed false. Understood in this way, Descartes' Discourse on Method has some very interesting features. It results in knowledge that is completely certain, and it imposes a certain structure on knowledge. This hierarchical structure of knowledge, with which this work is closely connected, is grounded in a structure of successively more metaphysical, basic truth, ultimately terminating in an intuition remain basic to his thought. Pointedly, certainty was central to Descartes' epistemology, and the path to it begins with doubt. In Meditation 1 entitled, What Can Be Called Into Doubt? Descartes says that, I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. Following that, he presents a series of 3 skeptical arguments designed to eliminate his past and current beliefs in preparation for replacing them with certainties. The strategy is to undermine the beliefs, not one by one, but by undermining the basic principles on which they rest. The first argument is directed at the naive belief that everything learned through the senses is worthy of belief. Against this, Descartes points out that he has found that the senses often deceive, and it is wise never to completely trust the senses that do sometimes deceive. The second, the famous dream argument, is directed against the somewhat less naive view that the senses are at least worthy of belief when dealing with middle-sized objects in our immediate vicinity. Descartes conceives that there is no clear way of distinguishing between a dream state and the state of being awake. He explains that even if he doubts the reliability of what the senses seem to be conveying to him at the present, the dream argument still leaves open the possibility that there are some general truths not directly dependent on his present sensation, which he can know. Descartes replies to this with his deceiving God argument, the argument that God may deceive him to take things that are true to be false. In a bid not to rub off the goodness of God, Descartes opines that God cannot deceive him to believe a proposition to be true when in fact it is false. Rather, it is an evil genius that has employed all his energies to deceive him. This separate argument helps to prevent the return of the former beliefs called into doubt. This argument have a crucial function in Descartes' project. They free us from all our preconceived opinions and provide the easiest route by which the mind may be led away from the senses. In this way, the skeptical doubt of meditation 1 prepares the mind for certainty to which Descartes aspires. Having completed the skeptical argument in meditation 1, Descartes moves to his general principle of inquiry, which is to accept only propositions that he understands with clarity and distinctness to be true. While he regards the existence of physical objects, that is, including his own body, as uncertain, he finds the reality of his mind unequally secure against all doubts. However, determined his skepticism, he cannot doubt that he is doubting. In his most famous statement, that is, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, he expresses the certainty of his own existence as a thinking being and identifies the point from which his effort or reconstruct his belief could proceed. Consequently, the discovery of the existence of the self serves as the first step towards certainty. It is the Archimedean point from which the whole structure of knowledge will grow. He hopes to uncover a proposition that would prove itself immune to even the most relentless skepticism, and that could provide a firm foundation for the reconstruction of a system of beliefs. Spinoza as a rationalist. The definition feature of Spinoza's thought is its uncompromising rationalism. Like other philosophers of his time, Spinoza is a rationalist in at least three different senses: metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical. That is to say, he maintains that the universe embodies a necessary rational order, that in principle, this order is knowable by the human mind, and that the true good for human beings consists in the knowledge of this order and a life governed by the knowledge. For the purpose of this course, we shall concentrate on the epistemological aspect of his rationalism. Spinoza distinguishes three grades of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge, which he called imagination, is an experientially determined knowledge, which can be based either on the perception of particular things or sign, which for Spinoza includes both sensory and memory images. Spinoza calls reason the second kind of knowledge. This is best described by distinguishing it from the first kind of knowledge, which is knowledge derived from vague experience called opinion or imagination. This corresponds roughly to sense experience. This is best described by distinguishing it from the kind of knowledge, which is knowledge derived from vague experience called opinion or imagination. This corresponds roughly to sense experience. From sense experience, we gain confused ideas of things with respect to their place in the general order of things. Full knowledge, which he refers to as the third kind of knowledge, is characterized as intuition. This kind of knowledge, according to him, proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes to an adequate knowledge of the essence of things. Spinoza calls this kind of knowledge intuition because in its essence it consists of seeing the world as a coherent whole bound by necessary connections. To have this kind of knowledge is the aim of philosophy, that is, to see things as conforming to a kind of necessity. Because the second and third kinds of knowledge involve adequate ideas, they cannot give rise to falsity. Sense experience alone can be the source of falsity. Through sense experience, we can have only confused ideas. Since ideas reflect particular modifications of reality in some finite respect, not in relation to the infinite attribute of God, sense experience is ordinarily thought of as a passive form of knowledge due to its inadequacy as opposed to form of knowledge which demand the use of reason. The consequence of Spinoza's view about this kind of knowledge is that it is possible to have knowledge which is not perfect without having a true idea. Spinoza says that such knowledge is knowledge from what one may render as uncertain or inconstant experience. By this, he meant that the ideas involved are fragmentary and without rational order. This in essence implies that there is a kind of knowledge, namely imagination, which involves inadequate or false ideas. It is to be noted that although reason and intuition are sources of adequate knowledge, Spinoza recognizes a major sense in which intuition is superior, whereas the province of reason concerns general truth based on common notions and consequently is abstract and general. That of intuition concerns the individual case and consequently is concrete and particular. Thus, for Spinoza, the goal of all knowledge is seeing the world as a single whole. The way to this is reason or science, which attempts to reveal things as subject to necessity by means of self-evidence, necessary truth. Leibniz rationalism has its basis in the claim that all ideas are innate. He argues that there are certain particular ideas that are innate to the mind and do not and cannot come through the senses. The ideas of being, possibility, and infinity are so thoroughly innate that they enter into our thoughts and reasoning. Hence, he regards them as essential to our minds. He supports his argument for innate ideas with the claim that nothing can enter the mind from outside and nothing can be taught to us whose ideas we do not already have in mind. In spite of his claim that all ideas are innate, Leibniz distinguishes between the ideas of sensation that in a certain sense come to us from outside and the ideas that do not and cannot do so. He explains that we receive knowledge from outside by way of the senses, maintaining that ideas derived from the senses are always confused. In line with the above, Leibniz makes a distinction between ideas of the intellect and those of sensation. The distinction, according to him, is a matter of distinctness and confusion, and it is this confusion that explains and underlies sensation. Also, it distinguishes between two types of truth: truth of reasoning and truth of fact. The first type of truth can be known with certainty by a finite demonstration consisting of a finite number of steps containing simple ideas, definitions, and postulates. These truths are necessary and can be known a priori. They depend on the principle of contradiction, since their necessity derives from the fact that their denial would result in a contradiction. Mathematical truths are of this kind. According to Leibniz, such truths are innate, and we have an innate capacity to recognize them. Truth or fact, on the other hand, have their basis in a separate principle, the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz tends to formulate the principle by reference to the universe. He argues that since there is infinity of possible universe in God's idea, and since only one of them can exist, there must be a sufficient reason for God's choice, a reason which determines him towards one thing rather than another. This he calls the principle of sufficient reason. Any contingent truth about this world has for its justification the fact that in choosing this world, God chose it as the best of all possible worlds. The truth remains contingent because it is dependent on God's choice, but a sufficient reason for its truth is that God chose it as part of the best of all possible worlds. This principle, that is, the principle of the sufficient reason, entails that the universe is in principle rational and intelligible. God must always act for a reason, and as a consequence, there must be a reason for everything. This doctrine of creation underlies all his philosophy. How is knowledge related to belief and justification? Epistemology is concerned with related concepts such as belief and justification. In virtually every traditional account of justification, belief and justification are components of knowledge. This is a major reason why epistemologists are interested in these concepts. Another reason is that there are certain areas where knowledge is difficult to come by, and yet where some well-founded or justified belief is possible. Guiding role that knowledge can play for us in other areas. Indeed, some philosophers such as Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1969, who are in general doubtful about the possibility of many kinds of knowledge, who maintain that the idea of justifiable belief is of more importance and interest than the idea of knowledge itself. Study session summary. In this study session, we examined epistemology as one of the branches of philosophy. We looked at how the term epistemology can be defined. We learned that there are two sources of knowledge. There are experience and reason. These two sources are viewed as ways of deriving knowledge by two different schools of thought, empiricism and rationalism. You also learned that knowledge is related to concepts such as belief and justification. We have come to the end of study session 1. Thanks for listening.